the 17th of January, 1943. Guadalcanal, the Solomon Islands. The rain comes in sheets across the jungle canopy, heavy and relentless, turning the volcanic soil into black mud that clings to everything it touches. In a foxhole carved into the hillside overlooking the Matanikau River, a Japanese sergeant named Yamada Kenji presses his body against the earth, his Type 38 rifle clutched against his chest. The metal is cold, slick with moisture. He hasn't eaten in 4 days, nothing but a handful of rice gone soft in the humidity, rationed from a supply drop that never came. His stomach has stopped growling. It simply aches now, a dull, constant companion to the fever that makes his vision swim at the edges. Through the curtain of rain, he can see the American positions across the river valley, 200 meters, maybe less. And then the wind shifts, carrying something impossible through the thick tropical air. The smell of cooking meat, hot food, real food. Not the faint memory of fish or the phantom scent of miso that sometimes haunts his dreams, but actual beef, sizzling over flame, mixed with the yeasty aroma of fresh bread. Yamada's hand trembles against the wooden stock of his rifle. He closes his eyes, certain he is hallucinating, that the malaria has finally broken something fundamental in his mind. But the smell doesn't fade. It grows stronger. Across that narrow strip of contested jungle, United States Marines were sitting in their own foxholes, eating hot meals delivered to the front line in insulated containers called mermite cans. They ate roasted chicken, beef stew, mashed potatoes with gravy, canned peaches in heavy syrup, fresh bread still warm to the touch. They drank hot coffee sweetened with real sugar. They did this while artillery shells screamed overhead and machine gun fire chattered through the trees. They did this within sight and smell of an enemy slowly starving to death in the same rain, on the same island, fighting the same war. This was not an accident. This was doctrine. To understand the profound psychological weapon that American military logistics represented in the Pacific Theater, one must first understand what the Japanese soldier had been taught to expect from war itself. The Imperial Japanese Army operated on a philosophy inherited from centuries of samurai tradition, refined through the Meiji Restoration, and weaponized by nationalist ideology in the 1930 seconds. It was called Seishin Kyoiku, spiritual education. The core belief was simple and absolute. Superior spirit could overcome material disadvantage. Willpower could defeat machinery. Discipline could conquer hunger. Japanese infantry training in the years leading to World War II was deliberately harsh, designed to strip away weakness and forge men who could endure anything. Recruits were beaten, starved, subjected to sleep deprivation and forced marches that killed the frail. Food was scarce by design. Comfort was considered corrupting. A soldier who complained about hunger was not a soldier at all, but a liability, a man whose spirit had not been properly tempered. The Japanese military manual Sen Jinkun, issued to all troops in 1941, made this explicit. Do not live in shame as a prisoner. Die to ensure you do not leave behind a name of infamy. Suffering was not a failure of logistics. It was proof of dedication. This philosophy had served Japan well in its wars against China and Russia. Japanese soldiers had endured brutal conditions, outlasted better-equipped opponents, and won through sheer refusal to surrender. When the Pacific War began in December 1941, Japanese forces swept across Southeast Asia and the Pacific Islands with shocking speed, overwhelming colonial armies that had grown soft in garrison duty. Japanese commanders looked at American troops and saw exactly what their ideology predicted: spoiled, comfort-dependent men from a nation drowning in luxury, soldiers who would crumble the moment their supply lines were cut, who would surrender rather than endure real hardship. They were wrong, but not in the way they expected. The United States military approached war from an entirely different philosophical foundation. American doctrine, forged in the Industrial Revolution and refined through World War I, held that morale was not separate from material conditions, it was directly dependent on them. A well-fed soldier fought better than a starving one. A rested soldier made fewer mistakes than an exhausted one. This was not considered weakness. It was considered efficiency. The American way of war was not about spiritual transcendence over physical limitation. It was about eliminating physical limitation entirely. The U.S. Quartermaster Corps, the logistical backbone of the American military, had spent the years between the world wars obsessing over a single question. How do you feed millions of men in combat zones thousands of miles from home? The answer became one of the most sophisticated supply chains ever created. By 1943, the system could deliver 3 hot meals per day to frontline troops in almost any theatre of operations, not occasionally, not when convenient, every single day. The Mermite can, that cylindrical container Yamada smelled across the Guadalcanal jungle, was the visible endpoint of an invisible empire of logistics. Each can could hold 10 gallons of food and keep it hot for hours through insulation technology developed specifically for this purpose. Behind each Mermite can stood a field kitchen unit with trained cooks, mobile stoves, and refrigerated trucks. Behind those trucks stood supply ships, cargo planes, and entire port facilities dedicated to food distribution. Behind those ships stood farms in Iowa, cattle ranches in Texas, canneries in California, bakeries in Pennsylvania, an entire continental economy retooled for war production. The daily ration for a United States Marine in combat in 1943 contained approximately 4,000 calories. For comparison, a Japanese soldier was officially allocated 1,800 calories per day, and that was only on paper, only when supply lines functioned, which they increasingly did not. But the gap was not merely quantitative. It was qualitative, symbolic, ideological. An American Marine ate steak, a Japanese soldier ate rice when he was lucky, and tree bark when he was not. Lieutenant Watanabe Shiro, a platoon commander in the 38th Division, kept a diary throughout the Guadalcanal campaign. The diary survived the war, discovered in a cave shelter after the island fell, and was later translated by American intelligence officers. His entries trace a slow psychological disintegration that had nothing to do with combat and everything to do with hunger. The 14th of August 1942. Landed successfully, morale high, men eager for contact with the enemy. The 3rd of September 1942. Rice supplies delayed. Supplement rations with coconut and captured American provisions. The enemy tinned meat is strangely sweet. The 12th of October 1942. 3rd supply convoy sunk by American aircraft. Reduced rations to half. Some men showing signs of weakness, but discipline holds. The 8th of November 1942. Rations reduced again. 1 cup of rice per day. Men boil leather straps for soup. I ordered them to stop complaining. This is what we trained for. The 1st of December 1942. Can hear the Americans cooking. Can smell it. The men don't speak anymore. I don't know if it's discipline or despair. The 24th of December 1942. America is not a country. It is a storehouse with an army. That final entry, written in shaking characters, represents a moment of ideological rupture. Watanabe had been trained his entire military career to believe that American wealth was a weakness, that abundance bred softness, that soldiers raised in comfort would break when faced with real hardship. But Guadalcanal revealed the opposite truth. American abundance was not a weakness, it was a weapon system. The psychology of combat is not merely about courage under fire or tactical skill, it is about sustainability of belief. A soldier can endure terrible things if he believes his suffering has meaning, if he trusts that his commanders are competent, if he feels that his nation has given him the tools to win. Japanese soldiers on Guadalcanal were brave, often suicidally so, launching banzai charges against fortified positions with bayonets fixed, screaming into machine gun fire. But bravery cannot be eaten. Courage does not cure dysentery. And by late 1942, as American air and naval superiority choked off Japanese supply routes, the spiritual education of the Imperial Army collided with the material reality of industrial warfare. Japanese soldiers began to starve. not slowly, but catastrophically. Within weeks of the supply lines breaking, men were eating grass, chewing on tree roots, hunting rats in the jungle. Beriberi set the in, caused by vitamin deficiency, making limbs swell and hearts fail. Dysentery turned the jungle trails into open sewers. Malaria, always present, became lethal when combined with malnutrition. The body simply had no resources left to fight infection. Japanese war diaries from this period describe men too weak to hold their rifles, soldiers who fell during night marches and were left behind because no one had the strength to carry them. And every day, every single day, the smell of American cooking drifted across the front lines. This was not an intentional psychological operation, not at first. The US military fed its troops hot meals because that was standard procedure, part of the logistical doctrine that treated food as ammunition. But the secondary effect was devastating. Japanese soldiers, raised on an ideology that claimed spirit could overcome matter, were forced to confront the fact that the enemy ate better while fighting than they did while resting. The ideological foundation began to crack. Private First Class Eugene Sledge, a Marine who fought on Peleliu and Okinawa later in the war, wrote in his memoir, With the Old Breed, about the surreal experience of eating hot meals under fire. He described sitting in a foxhole, exhausted after a night patrol, when a jeep rolled up with Mermite cans strapped to the back. The cook, a man Sledge had never seen before and would never see again, served him scrambled eggs, bacon, toast, and coffee. Real eggs, real bacon, coffee hot enough to burn his tongue. Sledge wrote, I sat there in the mud, holding a metal tray of food that would have been ordinary at any diner in America, and I realized that we weren't just fighting with guns, we were fighting with everything. Our whole country was behind us, every farm and factory, and that morning it came right to my foxhole in the form of breakfast. That realization that the American war effort was total, material, and seemingly inexhaustible was profound for American soldiers. But for Japanese soldiers, observing from the other side, it was devastating. Captured Japanese documents from Guadalcanal reveal the psychological impact. One intelligence report, intercepted and translated by U.S. codebreakers, came from a Japanese battalion commander reporting to his divisional headquarters. Enemy morale remains inexplicably high despite heavy casualties. They show no signs of supply shortage. Frontline units observed receiving hot food daily. Recommend we reconsider estimates of American industrial capacity. Another report, recovered from a dead officer at Cape Esperance, was more blunt. We cannot win a war of attrition against an enemy who treats war like a camping trip. The symbolic object that comes to define this clash of ideologies is not a weapon, not a flag, but a simple tin can. The American C ration, and its successor, the K ration, became objects of obsession for Japanese soldiers. These were individual field rations, designed to be carried by soldiers and eaten without preparation. Each ration contained a full meal: canned meat, crackers, cheese, chocolate, cigarettes, coffee, sugar, gum. To an American GI, they were barely tolerable, often complained about as bland or monotonous. To a starving Japanese soldier, they were evidence of something beyond comprehension. Japanese troops learned to recognize the sound of American C ration cans being opened, the specific scrape of the P-38 can opener, the pop of the vacuum seal breaking. In the jungle quiet between artillery barrages, that sound carried, and it meant the enemy was eating. Again. When Japanese soldiers overran American positions' rare victories in the later stages of the Pacific War, they did not prioritize capturing ammunition or weapons. They fought each other for access to American food supplies. Japanese accounts describe men weeping over cans of Spam, soldiers who opened tins of peaches and ate them so quickly they vomited, then ate more. One Japanese private, captured on Saipan in 1944, told his interrogators through a translator, "We thought you were weak because you needed so much. We did not understand that you brought so much because you could. We confused your strength for weakness. That was our mistake." the can became a symbol of American material philosophy. Standardized, mass-produced, efficient, abundant. Each can was identical to millions of others, stamped out by factories running 3 shifts, delivered across oceans by Liberty ships, built faster than they could be sunk. The can represented industrial democracy, not the ideology of individual heroism or spiritual transcendence, but the grinding, impersonal, overwhelming power of an economy that could outproduce the world combined. By February 1943, Guadalcanal was lost. Japanese forces evacuated under cover of darkness, leaving behind thousands of dead and an island that had consumed an entire army. Of the 36,000 Japanese troops deployed to Guadalcanal, 20,000 died, but only a fraction of those deaths came from combat. Most died from starvation and disease. The island became known among Japanese survivors as Gato Starvation Island. It was a name spoken with bitterness, a recognition that they had been defeated not by American courage or tactical brilliance, but by American logistics. The pattern repeated across the Pacific. On New Guinea, Japanese soldiers were reduced to cannibalism, eating their own dead and, in documented cases, killing stragglers from other units for meat. On Bougainville, entire companies dissolved in the jungle, men wandering away from their units in search of food and never returning. On Saipan, Japanese civilians committed mass suicide rather than face capture, but soldiers surrendered for the first time in significant numbers, not because American propaganda convinced them, but because they were too weak to hold weapons. The Imperial Japanese Army had bet everything on the ideology of spiritual strength. They had trained their soldiers to endure suffering as proof of dedication. They had built a military culture where logistics was considered secondary to willpower, where asking for adequate supplies was considered a moral failure. And for a time, against weaker opponents, it worked. But against an enemy who arrived with aircraft carriers and floating supply depots, with field bakeries and refrigerated ships, with a logistical system that treated hot meals as a basic right rather than a luxury, the ideology collapsed. There is a photograph, taken on Okinawa in June 1945, that captures this disparity in a single frame. In the foreground, 2 Marines sit on empty ammunition crates, eating from mess trays. One is laughing at something, the other said. Behind them, barely visible at the edge of the frame, a Japanese prisoner sits in the mud, skeletal, thin, staring at the Marine's food with an expression that the photograph cannot quite capture, but that every viewer recognizes instinctively. It is not anger. It is not even hunger. It is incomprehension. The look of a man confronting evidence that shatters his understanding of the world. American military planners understood morale as engineering problem. The question was not, how brave are our soldiers, but what conditions produce sustained combat effectiveness. The answer involved calories, vitamins, rest cycles, mail delivery, recreational facilities, rotation schedules, an entire science of human sustainability. The U.S. military did not expect its soldiers to transcend physical needs through spiritual strength. It expected to meet those needs through logistical competence. This was not softness. This was a different definition of strength. The ability to project power across 6,000 miles of ocean and still deliver hot coffee to a foxhole was not a sign of weakness. It was the ultimate expression of industrial dominance. Every hot meal represented thousands of tons of shipping, hundreds of hours of planning, the coordinated labor of millions of workers who would never see combat, but whose contribution was equally essential. The meal was the weapon. The logistics was the strategy. Japanese military leadership understood this too late. By 1944, internal documents show a shift in assessment. One report from Imperial General Headquarters in Tokyo acknowledged, "The American advantage is not merely numerical or technological. They have built a system of war that eliminates traditional soldier virtues as factors. Endurance, discipline, and willingness to sacrifice mean nothing when the enemy does not require such qualities. They have engineered hardship out of warfare." But this understanding produced no solution, because Japan lacked the industrial capacity to replicate the American system. The home islands were already under blockade. The merchant fleet was being systematically destroyed. The factories could barely produce ammunition, let alone field kitchens and refrigerated transport. Japanese soldiers in the Philippines, in Burma, on bypassed Pacific islands, continued to starve while eating tree bark and wondering how an enemy nation could be so impossibly rich. The ideological damage was irreparable. Post-war interviews with Japanese veterans reveal a consistent theme. The shock of American abundance broke something fundamental in their understanding of the war. They had been told they were fighting a decadent enemy weakened by luxury. Instead, they encountered an enemy who brought luxury to the battlefield and fought harder because of it. One veteran, interviewed in the 1970 seconds, said, "We were told that American soldiers were cowards who would run when hungry. But they never got hungry. How do you defeat an enemy who eats steak while bombing you?" The smell of cooking meat across the Guadalcanal jungle was not just a sensory experience, it was an ideological message, transmitted in the most primal language possible. It said, "We have so much that we can afford to waste it on the front line. We are so strong that we consider hot meals a basic standard, not a luxury. We have mastered the material world so completely that even in the worst conditions, we recreate home." Yamada Kenji, the Japanese sergeant who smelled that cooking meat in January 1943, did not survive the war. His body was found 3 weeks later in the same foxhole, dead from starvation and dysentery, his rifle still clutched in skeletal hands. He was 23 years old. He had been a university student studying literature before conscription. He had believed in spiritual strength, in the superiority of Japanese discipline, in the inevitability of victory. He died within smelling distance of hot food he would never taste, evidence of an enemy industrial capacity he had been trained not to believe in. There is no way to know what thoughts passed through his mind in those final days. But his diary, recovered later, contains a final entry dated January 29, written in characters so shaky they are barely legible. "I was wrong about everything." The American ability to feed its soldiers hot meals during active combat was not an incidental detail of the Pacific War. It was a manifestation of a fundamental philosophical difference about how wars are won. The Japanese military believed in the primacy of spirit, that superior will and discipline could overcome material disadvantage. The American military believed in the primacy of systems, that superior logistics and organization would produce victory regardless of individual heroism. Both sides were partially correct. War requires courage, sacrifice, and determination. But it also requires food, ammunition, fuel, medical care, and the industrial capacity to deliver those necessities across continents and oceans. The Japanese military cultivated the former while neglecting the latter. The American military assumed the former while engineering the latter to an unprecedented degree. The result was not just a military victory, but an ideological one. Japanese soldiers did not merely lose battles, they lost faith in the worldview that had sent them to war. The sight and smell of American abundance, delivered daily to the front lines, demonstrated that their suffering was not a mark of superior spirit, but a symptom of inferior logistics. They had been taught to despise comfort and embrace hardship, and then they watched an enemy who rejected both extremes. Americans did not wallow in luxury, nor did they glorify suffering. They simply solved problems. After the war, as Japan rebuilt under American occupation, the legacy of this logistical dominance shaped everything. The country that had preached spiritual strength over material wealth became obsessed with industrial efficiency. The military culture that had starved its soldiers by design was dismantled and replaced with democratic institutions that prioritized human welfare. And a generation of Japanese men carried memories they rarely discussed. The smell of American food drifting across jungle battlefields, the impossible sight of enemy soldiers eating hot meals under fire, the slow realization that they had been sent to fight a war their nation had no capacity to win. The Mermite can, that humble insulated container, became a museum piece displayed now in military history collections, as an artifact of American logistical prowess, but it represents something more than operational efficiency. It represents a philosophy of war that said, "Take care of your soldiers, and they will take care of the mission. Meet their basic needs, and they will exceed all expectations. Bring abundance to the battlefield, and you bring an unbeatable weapon." In the end, the lesson of the Pacific War was not about firepower or tactics or even industrial capacity in the abstract. It was about the simple, profound truth that human beings fight better when they are fed. That morale is not separate from material conditions but grows directly from them. That a hot meal in a foxhole is worth more than 1,000 speeches about duty and honor. That logistics is not the boring background of war, it is the substance of war, the foundation upon which everything else rests. The Japanese soldier could not believe that American Marines ate hot meals during active frontline fighting because it contradicted everything he had been taught about war, about strength, about what it meant to be a soldier. He had been trained to see hunger as a test of character, deprivation as proof of dedication. The American Marine, eating scrambled eggs from a Mermite can while artillery roared overhead, represented a different truth. That strength comes not from enduring hardship, but from eliminating it. That victory belongs not to those who suffer most beautifully, but to those who solve problems most effectively. And somewhere in that gap between starvation and sustenance, between ideology and engineering, between the soldier who starved for his beliefs and the soldier who ate breakfast before battle, the outcome of the war was decided long before the last shot was fired.